Picture the year 2040. There are no riots in the streets of Vancouver, no breaking news alerts saying the economy has collapsed. The grocery stores are still stocked and everyone is still commuting to work. On the surface, everything looks completely normal, but it feels hollowed out. It feels thinner. I was reading a federal foresight report from Policy Horizons Canada today called Future Lives, and they outlined this exact scenario. They don't actually call it a crash, they call it a slow squeeze. So imagine your son is 35 years old. He played by all the rules they taught him. He went to university, he got the professional job, he didn't rack up any credit card debt, and yet he's still renting a 600 square foot box with two roommates. Not because he's waiting for the market to cool down to buy, but because owning a piece of dirt is now mathematically impossible in 2040 without a massive check from you or an inheritance check from Rama. Now look at your daughter. She's 33. She and her partner make way more money on paper than you ever did at their age. But taxes, rent, childcare, eat every single dollar before the month is over. Saving for a down payment isn't even in their radar anymore. Basically, only basic survival is on their radar anymore. So the drift in the wealth transfer and this economic drift doesn't spare the older generation either. Look at your 72-year-old neighbor. He's standing at the counter of the local coffee shop working until 6 a.m. or working from a 6 a.m. rush. And he's not there because he needs a hobby in his golden year. He's there because his retirement age quietly drifted from 65 to 70 and now probably even 75. His savings couldn't outrun the cost of living, and he literally cannot afford to stop working. In this 2040 reality, when someone in your family actually does manage to buy a home, it's not because the bank was impressed by their T4 or their work ethic. It's because maybe, grandma left them an inheritance check or you sent them a big check in the mail. So the rules didn't officially change, but home ownership just became a straight transfer of wealth. And so why is this happening? Because our federal debt is, a $1.5 trillion anchor now, and we're running structural deficits just to keep the lights on. And while inflation eats your groceries and wages stay flat, you're working harder, but your dollars are losing every muscle every single month. So people are stuck in what I call the commiseration rut, right? They sit around over expensive craft beers, nodding their heads, agreeing that the system is rigged. And they're right. The system is rigged. It is rigged. But sitting in that rut, in a slow motion death sentence of your net worth, is not the way out. If you don't own the ground that you stand on in this economy, you're basically not a citizen. You're an ATM. You're like a liquidity source for the people who actually own the assets. Now, it feels bleak because for 90% of the population, it is bleak, right? So 10%, usually 10% of the population in Canada own all these assets. So this is where I come in as a devil's advocate. This is where I'm going to play the other side of this. And for a minute, you're probably going to be a little confused, but someone has to say this. Most people are using this nightmare as an excuse to do nothing. They see the debt, they see the 2040 report, they see the higher interest rates, they see the jobless numbers, and they decide that they're going to sit on the sidelines and they're going to wait for certainty. But certainty is the most expensive commodity in the world. By the time the news tells you that everything is okay, the opportunity has been priced out. And the rules of the game actually hasn't changed. The players just got scared. I've been in the trenches of the Vancouver real estate market for 20 plus years now, and I've seen the booms. I've seen every Uber driver thinks that they're a developer. I've seen crashes where, a lot of big people are hiding under their desks because they lost a lot of money. And I'm telling you, the end of the world is usually the only time that the door is left unlocked, where it's left open for you to come in and put an offer on something that you actually want. So here's the 10% silver lining in this whole overcast sky. For the first time in a decade, the genius crowd, the one that was running, around when interest rates were super low, they're gone. And, at that time, you were fighting with over 20 bidders for a house. Even though it had a leaky basement, you didn't even care to do an inspection. You were paying $200,000 over asking price, and you considered yourself lucky to be able to get that house. Now, that wasn't investing. That was a collective fever dream. Okay? Today, that fever has broken. And so these are the exact times when you're able to actually buy a property in Vancouver where prices have gone lower. But the actual opposite tends to happen, and people walk away and they despair and they wait for certainty. And like I said, certainty is the most expensive commodity that ever existed, and that's exactly where profit is hidden. Is usually during these times. Everyone's crying about interest rates being high, but let's get some perspective here. Facts are better than opinions, and if you look at the 50-year chart of rates, these rates are not high. They're actually still historically low. In fact, for decades low. So we've been living under a financial freak show for the last decade. That's why these rates feel high. Those 1% and 2% rates that we had during the pandemic and after the pandemic, those were anomalies that distorted the entire world. I mean, some of my mentors were buying properties in the 80s with 18% interest rate, just to give you an idea. Even in the 90s, they were really happy to get an 8% rate. And what we have now is a normal market in terms of interest rates. But because everyone has a short-term memory, they think the sky is falling. But look at what these normal rates actually do amazing things for serious buyers. First of all, negotiations back. For 10 years, negotiation in Vancouver meant how much more can I pay than the list price for me not to get laughed at. And now you can actually look at a seller in the eye and make a demand. You can ask for a repair. You can insist on an inspection. I mean, imagine that. You can actually know what you're buying before you sign away 30 years of your life. And second, inventory is sitting, and is sitting at quite a high rate. So you have the luxury of time. You don't have to make a multi-million-dollar decision on a Sunday afternoon before you go get ice cream. You can run the math. You can check the zoning. You can breathe. And all these things. So the speculators and the quick get rich quick flippers, they're gone. And usually, they can't handle these carrying costs at this point because they got trapped in that 1 or 2% rate. It's just serious sellers now, right? And that requires a serious buyer. So these rates are your filter. They're the amateurs, they're the amateur killers. In 2011, I was down in the Phoenix market, and in Vancouver as we're in 2008. In Phoenix, Arizona, it was a graveyard. I mean, it was just after the financial crisis, and people were literally handing their keys to the bank and crying on the sidewalks. The headlines in the Phoenix newspapers were saying that Phoenix was a ghost town and it would never recover. But once again, I played devil's advocate at that point, and I looked at the cost to build a house versus the cost to buy one that was already standing. And to build, buying was actually 50% cheaper than the lumber and the labor to build a home. So the math didn't really care about the ghost town narrative. I bought, and people called me crazy, But today, those properties are the bedrock of my portfolio, and they have 10x since. I bought when the drift was at its peak, when fear was at its peak, which is exactly what's happening here in the Canadian real estate market. So how do you win in Vancouver right now? How do you get over this middle class trap that we're going to see in 2040? Well, you can, there's a couple of ways you can play it, but one way definitely is to buy real estate when inventory is sitting this high and when builders have built too much and when there is, government intervention, lowering demand. You can target the renewal panic, for instance. You look at owners who bought in 2020 and 2021. Their 2% rates are now sitting, they're probably going to have to renew, and their rates are sitting at 6 to 7%. So they're sweating it. So their sweat could be your equity. When you hit them with a stink bid, which is a professional lowball offer, and you make it's possible that you can make the listing agent cough. Because it's so low, but you don't do it to be mean. You do it because this is the price which you're willing to pay, and you're providing a liquidity for someone who needs an exit, right? They may not be able to afford their payment, so you're actually a way out for them. So, we sent many stink bids in the Phoenix market at that point in 2011, and they got accepted by the banks because they needed that liquidity. So. If you're in between 30 years old and 50 years old, you really can't afford to wait. And the reason is because the government's going to continue to print money, right? They're not going to pay their debt. They're not going to pay the debt down. No government most governments in the world have never paid their debt. What they do is they inflate their way out of it. So they picture this: they have a tree in their backyard. They have a money-making tree where they get to print money. So when they print money, more of it is in circulation. They distribute it out and they collect tax dollars. I mean, I'm putting it in a nutshell. Essentially, they print their way out because they can print it and they pay the debt, right? We don't have that tree. We don't have that certainty. So uncertainty is the only discount you're ever going to get. And what we have right now is uncertainty. So The government talks about affordability, but they keep the supply, chains choked, and that incompetence is your insurance policy. Your asset value is protected by their inability to build. So another thing you can do is you can focus on a value add. Don't just buy a condo. If you can't afford to buy a house and you can add a suite to that house, perhaps you can rezone that property, or perhaps you can add an extra bedroom in a condo if you decide to buy a condo. So you add value, you create value where others just see a monthly payment. You can rent that bedroom to a roommate, or you can make that suite and then have a tenant pay part of your mortgage. And that's a great strategy. And lastly, make sure you put an offer that makes you embarrassed. You should be embarrassed. If you're not a little embarrassed by your first offer, you're probably paying too much, especially in this market. Look, the 2040 report is a warning. It's not a prophecy. You can choose to be the person who watches the middle class disappear, or you can be the one who owns the infrastructure that they're renting. Now, I don't say this to be mean or because I'm actually doing this. I'm enabling this to happen. It is happening one way or the other. The government is going to continue to print money. We have way too much debt, and we don't have the productivity capacity to be able to pay that debt off. So the trajectory is set, and this is going to happen. You can choose to drift, or you can choose to drive. Comment below, what is the one sign in your neighborhood where the drift is happening? Do you see it? And if you see it, let me know in the comments below. If you want the truth without all the sugar coating and all the stuff, please subscribe to my channel. My name is Richard Morrison. Stay calm and go put those low bids out there.